The COP29 talks have opened today in Baku in Azerbaijan with renewed calls for global cooperation to combat climate disaster. The head of the United Nations World Meteorological Organization said she's sounding a red alert, saying this is another SOS for the planet. The re-election of Donald Trump has cast a shadow on this year's talks. He's described climate change in the past as a hoax, while the choice of Azerbaijan to host this year's conference has also raised eyebrows. This from France 24's Emerald Maxwell.
Dubbed the Finance COP, the goal of this year's summit, getting money to the developing countries facing the worst effects of climate change. These nations are pushing for at least $1 trillion a year, which the United Nations climate chief said should not be seen as charity, because no country was immune from the climate crisis.
An ambitious new climate finance goal is entirely in the self-interest of every single nation, including the largest and the wealthiest.
The developed countries that currently contribute the money want other rich nations and top emitters, including China and the Gulf states, to pitch in too, an idea firmly rejected by Beijing. Many leaders, including those of China and the United States, were conspicuous by their absence at COP29. But worse could be yet to come, in the shape of US President-elect Donald Trump, who has promised to again pull out of the 2015 Paris Agreement. The US climate envoy said Monday, though, that Trump's election victory wouldn't stop the work by American cities, states and citizens.
While the United States federal government under Donald Trump may put climate action on the back burner, the work to contain climate change is going to continue in the United States with commitment and passion and belief.
It was a sentiment echoed by climate activists.
The work must go on. It cannot and does not hinge on any one country. And Trump's re-election can never be an excuse for other nations to scale back the ambition needed.
With 2024 likely to break new temperature records, the UN has warned that the world is on a path towards a catastrophic 3.1 degrees Celsius of warming this century based on current actions.
Well, I'm joined now here on France 24 by Henna Hundal, who is a lobbyist for various environmental groups and an activist on climate change. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy at the moment. It's very good of you to join us. I wanted just to ask the biggest thing, the elephant in the room that everyone is thinking of, this big issue that this year the United States delegation can pretty much agree to whatever they like, and Donald Trump might rip it up in January. What does that do to this COP29 summit?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate this discussion, and you raised some important questions. What does President-elect Trump's victory, really sweeping victory in the election last week, mean for the future of United States' commitment to global climate action? I think in many respects it remains a very open question, but we also know the fact that President Trump, when he was in his first term in office, he was certainly not great on the climate front. He wanted to remove the United States from the Paris Agreement during that term. He's probably going to do it again, according to his pledges. And he's also trying to roll back a lot of President Biden's climate legacy here in the United States. So I think what that really does is create a wide open vacuum for global climate leadership. And I'm really hoping that one of the other historical big emitters will step up to fill that gap.
But of course, the fact that the US is likely not to be pushing climate change issues means there's even less incentive for other major countries.
I think that's the fear right now. You see kind of across the board, a lot of the leaders that typically show up to these conferences are not purported to be coming this year. So you have President Biden, who's not coming for the second time. You have French President Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, Prime Minister Modi of India. So all these leaders that have a huge stake in these global climate discussions are not making face. And I think that really says something about where the climate crisis fits on their list of priorities. And we also know that the world, unfortunately, is rife with several geopolitical conflicts as well as political conflicts at home.
What about this other, a major embarrassment, really, that this conference is being hosted by Azerbaijan. It's a major oil producer, and allegations that it's been cutting deals behind the scenes. Doesn't that really undermine the entire conference? Again, this is being denounced by a lot of activists, perhaps yourself, as huge hypocrisy on the part of Azerbaijan.
No, I think it's really unfortunate when news like that comes out, because I derive so much inspiration from my colleagues all around the world. I've been talking with some colleagues who are already at the conference, and these are people who maybe come from developing countries, spend energy, effort, time, money that they don't always have to be able to go to these conferences, are going with their best foot forward, putting their full faith efforts into fighting the climate crisis, which is impacting their frontline communities so devastatingly. And so when we have these sort of different distractions, it really takes away from the work. So I'm, marching forward with hope with my fellow community of activists. I'm really buoyed by their efforts, and I hope that we can sort of refocus on the work ahead, because it's quite crucial, and we need everybody on board with a good faith effort.
So for people who don't follow climate issues closely and perhaps lose track of some of the COP conferences and what is agreed or not agreed, what is on the agenda this time? What might be agreed? Where are we on all of this?
Yeah, so COP29 has been characterized as the finance COP. So there are several different action items on the agenda around that theme. So we have, for example, the new collective quantified goal, which is trying to create this comprehensive financial framework to make sure that developing countries can more smoothly transition away from fossil fuels, reduce emissions, and also contend with the impacts of the climate crisis that they feel acutely. I'm also going to be watching for the Loss and Damage Fund, because last year, a lot of countries promised millions of dollars to go into this fund to help developing countries contend with the extremes of the climate crisis. We need to make sure that those pledges are actually seen through.
And what would you like to see come out of this year's COP29? We're hearing these frightening warnings about the state of climate change and the threat to the world. We've seen floods, we've seen numerous natural disasters, and we're not even at the end of this year. What would you like to come out of this year's conference?
Yeah, I think it's so important to set the stage in that regard. I mean, we had the hottest day on record this summer. We're on track for 2024 to be the hottest year on record, breaching that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit above pre-industrial levels that we've been warning about since the 2015 Paris Agreement. We know that, for example, in the United States, we just had serially destructive hurricanes causing over $53 billion in damages. I mean, this is the year for climate action to be front and center. And so I think one thing I'm really hopeful about is sort of cross-disciplinary collaborations on the climate crisis. We saw, for example, last year at COP28, there was the first ever health day where you saw ministers of health from countries around the world, healthcare practitioners come together and figure out how can they contend with this major impact of the climate crisis, the effects on public health that often is not talked about, but can be a great messaging tool for people to understand how climate change impacts their daily life. And so I'm looking forward to seeing more of those types of cross-disciplinary collaborations to remind people that no one is immune from this crisis and everyone has a role to play to help mitigate it.
OK, we just have a short time left. I wonder if perhaps here in Europe, there's a lot of complaining sometimes from businesses and various people that Europe is obsessed with climate change, that there are too many norms, too many regulations. How would you assess Europe on the world playing field? Are they good pupils in terms of climate change?
Well, according to the European Environment Agency, Europe is actually the fastest warming continent on the planet. So not only are they acutely affected by climate change, but they also have a great role to play, especially some of the historical big emitters there, to help mitigate it. And, you bring up the economic example, which I think is so interesting because that argument gets made over and over that the transition away from fossil fuels will create an economic impact that's very hard to sell to the electorate, for example. We've heard that argument, that very same argument in the United States. It's one that the Republican Party often tries to make. We also know that in the United States, the lion's share of clean energy investments from a recent landmark piece of legislation from President Biden have actually gone to Republican districts. So I think there are ways to make sure that we communicate the message around that clean energy transition in a way that makes everyone feel included. not like they're going to be left in the dark. I mean, if we look at COP26, the language of that pact was phase down of unabated coal power. We look at COP28, we talked about transition away from fossil fuels. These are not abrupt changes. These are going to be gradual. We're going to have to make sure that all communities are included in these decision-making processes and no one is left behind. And I think we need to do a better job of communicating that both in the US and in Europe.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Henna Hundal. Thank you for your time and sharing your thoughts with us from California there, Stanford University in California, talking to us here on France 24. And staying in the US.